It was one of those rare nights when I found myself alone in the house. My mom had stepped out to run some errands, assuring me she'd be back soon. I wasn't scared. The house felt safe, with the familiar streetlights casting a soft glow through my window. I'd made myself comfortable in my bedroom, a book in my lap and the reading light on, filling the room with a warm, steady light. The quiet was almost peaceful, a kind of silence that felt comforting and secure. Then, I heard it, a faint rustling sound outside, coming from the tree by the balcony that connected my room to my mom's. I figured it was just an animal, a bird or a squirrel, and went back to my book. But the sounds continued, a series of slow, deliberate movements that didn't quite fit the usual night noises. I glanced up, my eyes catching something in the faint light outside, a tall shadow crossing the glass doors. My breath caught as realization washed over me. Someone was on the balcony. My heart pounded as I quickly switched off my reading light, freezing in place. Through the dim light filtering in from the street, I saw the figure move slowly toward my mother's doors, his shadowed form barely more than a silhouette. He reached for her door handle, jiggling it quietly, as though testing whether it would give way. I sat there, too afraid to move, feeling trapped in the silence, hoping he'd just leave. My hand moved slowly to my own door, locking it in a quiet, deliberate motion, praying he wouldn't come toward my room. But I could hear his footsteps shift on the wooden balcony, the soft scrape of his shoes as he turned. He was coming to my doors, testing my handle next. My heart raced as I waited, terrified he'd find a way in. I barely breathed, hoping he'd think the house was empty, that he'd give up and leave. But instead, he lingered, pacing back and forth in front of the doors, his silhouette now faintly outlined against the glass, like a dark shadow waiting to come inside. The silence grew thick as I watched him, his figure just barely visible through the glass. His presence felt menacing, like a shadow come to life, and every second he lingered made the air feel heavier. My mind raced as he continued to test my door, jiggling the handle firmly but finding it locked. Relief mingled with terror as I realized I had remembered to lock it. But the relief was brief, giving way to a deeper, sharper fear as he began pacing again, his footsteps soft but deliberate. Then, he stopped right in front of my door. His shadow loomed large, unmoving, and I held my breath, waiting, dreading his next move. After a few moments of silence, his voice cut through the stillness, low and calm but chilling. "I could just break the glass, he said, his words heavy with threat. My heart pounded, every part of me paralyzed with fear. I sat there, unable to respond, barely able to breathe, feeling like a small target under his gaze. Just when I thought my fear couldn't get any worse, I saw a sudden flash of headlights from the driveway below. My mother's car was pulling in, illuminating the yard and spilling light onto the balcony. The man froze, turning to look toward the approaching vehicle. For a split second, he seemed to consider his options, his head moving slowly from my doors to the driveway, as if calculating his next move. Then, with a quick turn, he fled, disappearing into the shadows just as my mom stepped out of the car. I sat there, still too frightened to move, barely believing it was over. Relief washed over me, but my hands trembled as I unlocked my bedroom door and rushed to meet her, words tumbling out in a frantic, breathless stream. She listened, her face growing pale as she absorbed what had just happened. After calming me down, my mother immediately called the police. Officers arrived soon after, their lights casting a cold, harsh glow across the yard and balcony as they searched for any signs of the intruder. They looked for footprints, anything that might help them identify the man, but it seemed he had left no trace. My mother held me close, her hand gripping mine tightly as she tried to stay calm, though I could feel the fear in her every movement. Later, a neighbor approached one of the officers, mentioning that she'd seen a truck idling nearby earlier that evening. The description matched a vehicle linked to recent attempted child abductions in the area. The officers suspected the man had been watching the house, likely waiting for me to be alone. The realization sent a chill through me, a lasting reminder of how close I'd come to something terrible. The police never found the man, and though life eventually returned to normal, but in that night I learned to be cautious, to stay alert, and I'll never forget the terror of that shadow on the balcony or the voice that threatened to break the glass. It was a lesson I never wanted to learn, but one that I'd carry with me forever. Being left alone for a weekend was thrilling at first. My sister and I rarely had the house to ourselves. She was older, responsible, and I trusted her completely. Our parents had left early, reminding us to lock the doors and stick to our plans, which mostly meant watching movies and ordering takeout. As the day wore on, the excitement simmered down into an ordinary routine. My friend was supposed to come by soon, so I kept an ear out for her knock, eager for the company. The house felt quiet but safe, every creak and hum just a reminder of the familiar. It was the kind of quiet that only settles in when everything is just right. The afternoon light dimmed slowly, casting shadows that stretched lazily across the walls. My sister was upstairs, lost in her own world. I was by the front door, looking through the little glass window for any sign of my friend. There was a subtle comfort in the solitude, a feeling that all was as it should be. But then a knock came, sharp and unexpected. I jumped a little, immediately moving to open the door, assuming it was my friend. Without thinking, I turned the handle and pulled the door open, my mind still calm, unprepared for what I'd see. The man on the other side of the door wasn't my friend. Instead, he was a stranger, thin, with a clipboard in his hands and a blank look that I couldn't quite read. He wore a striped shirt, the colors muted and mismatched, as though he'd thrown on whatever was closest. His hair was unkempt, and something about him didn't quite add up. Still, I told myself there had to be an explanation. Before I could ask, he said he was there to check the gas meter. I hadn't thought much about gas meters or where they were even located. His words seemed straightforward enough, and the clipboard in his hands looked official. I assumed he was there on some routine job, so I stepped back, letting him in, barely giving it a second thought. Without a word of thanks or even a glance, he walked right past me, his steps deliberate as if he already knew the layout of our home. He moved through the living room and headed directly for the stairs. It struck me as odd, but before I could make sense of it, he was already halfway up. Something in the back of my mind whispered that he shouldn't be up there, but I told myself he was just doing his job. I hadn't moved from the doorway, my eyes fixed on the staircase where the stranger had disappeared. My mind played over the encounter, each detail feeling stranger the longer I thought about it. Just as the unease began to sink deeper, my sister came down the stairs, her expression shifting the moment she saw me by the door. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice tight. I told her he was here to check the gas meter, thinking that would put her at ease, but the color drained from her face instantly. She looked past me, toward the stairs, her eyes wide with something I hadn't seen before. Her hand gripped my shoulder, and she whispered urgently, "The gas meter is outside." The realization hit us both at once, unraveling the flimsy sense of safety that had lingered. Panic settled in as we stood there, frozen. My heart pounded as we listened to the sounds coming from upstairs. He was still up there, footsteps heavy against the floorboards, moving toward one of our bedrooms. The thought twisted in my stomach, turning fear into something darker. We needed to get out, but neither of us dared move, each second stretching longer as we tried to decide what to do. The fear that held us in place finally broke, and in a single, silent agreement, we moved toward the door. The man was still upstairs, oblivious to our escape. I opened the door, the air outside hitting me like a rush of freedom, though our safety was far from assured. We stepped out quickly, barely daring to breathe as we shut the door behind us, leaving the man alone inside. A man was walking his dog nearby, and without thinking, we ran toward him. My sister called out to him, explaining we needed help. He looked at us, concerned, and I could see he was piecing together our fear. Thinking quickly, my sister turned back toward the house and, raising her voice, called out in a tone loud enough to carry inside. "Dad, we're outside now." Her words echoed through the street, and for a moment, there was silence. Then I saw a movement by the window upstairs. The stranger appeared, his face obscured, but the way he looked out sent a chill through me. Realizing he'd been discovered, he hurried out of the house, glancing at us only briefly before disappearing down the street. The man with the dog stood with us until we were certain he was gone. and only then did we manage to breathe again. After locking the door and checking every window, we sat in silence, unable to shake the feeling of violation that clung to us. We never mentioned the incident to our parents, afraid of what they might say, afraid they wouldn't understand the depth of our fear. It was easier, we thought, to let it fade into a memory. But weeks later, our quiet was shattered when the news broke. A girl from the area had gone missing, last seen letting a man into her house under eerily similar circumstances. The description they released matched the stranger who had entered our home, right down to the clipboard he'd held. Suddenly, silence no longer felt like an option. We went to the police, relaying every detail, hoping it might help. They took our report seriously, but despite their efforts, the man was never found. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening, the kind that settles in with familiar routines and comforting silence. I was home alone with my two huskies, Luca and Bear, both usually calm and gentle, never prone to barking or acting out. They'd grown accustomed to quiet evenings like this one, making them ideal company when I was by myself. Around 8 p.m. after a long day, I decided to shower and unwind. The house felt secure, the hum of normalcy cocooning me as I went through my routine. With the bathroom door slightly ajar, I began blow-drying my hair, barely noticing the noise around me. But just as I lost myself in the rhythm of the dryer's roar, a strange, low howl pierced through, cutting through the noise in a way that made me stop. It wasn't just any sound, it was Luca, and it was a howl I'd never heard from him before. Long, deep, almost alarming. I switched off the dryer, suddenly aware of how silent the house had become. My heart picked up as I waited, listening, telling myself it must have been nothing. But as the seconds ticked by, I knew this was no ordinary evening. The silence didn't last long. A faint knock echoed from the front door, and instantly, both Luca and Bear erupted into a frenzy, barking and howling with an intensity that was as terrifying as it was unexpected. I'd never seen them act like this. They were leaping at the bay window in the living room, their claws scratching against the glass as though they were desperate to get outside, their bodies tense and focused on something I couldn't yet see. A chill crept up my spine as I stood frozen, listening to the chaotic sound of my dog's frantic warnings. They were throwing themselves against the window, barking in sync, their howls sharp and guttural. My curiosity and unease got the better of me, and I knew I had to find out what was going on. Keeping low, I crept over to the nearby bedroom window, trying to see what could have set my usually gentle dogs into such a wild state. Peering out, I saw them. 2 men in hoodies, standing at my front door, looking calm, almost too calm, as though the noise didn't bother them in the least. They were knocking louder now, the sound jarring against the husky's unrelenting howls. My stomach tightened. These weren't ordinary visitors. I pressed myself against the wall, peering through the narrow slit of the blinds to get a better view of the 2 figures outside. They were dressed similarly, dark hoodies pulled low over their faces, hands tucked in their pockets as they stood shoulder to shoulder on my doorstep. Their heads tilted slightly, ignoring the sounds coming from inside, unfazed by the chaos Luca and Bear were creating. Their calm felt wrong, a stark contrast to the frenzy within. Suddenly, Luca let out a deep, guttural growl, and Bear joined him, both of them moving toward the door with a force I hadn't seen in them before. Luca, my older husky, lunged forward, throwing himself against the door, his growl intensifying, a sound that seemed to rattle the walls. It was as if he'd sensed something deeply unsettling, something he couldn't ignore. The men exchanged a look, their confidence flickering for a moment. One of them stepped back, shifting his weight as if he'd only just realized the danger inside. Yet, they didn't turn to leave. Instead, they lingered, as if debating whether to press on or retreat. My grip tightened on the edge of the counter. I felt as though I were holding my breath, waiting, hoping they'd take the hint. The seconds stretched painfully, each one laced with tension as the men stood on the porch. Luca let out another furious snarl, throwing himself against the door once more, making it shake in its frame. Bear followed suit, both of them now barking, howling, and clawing at the door, creating a din that echoed through the quiet neighborhood. One of the men glanced nervously down the street, his posture now tense, eyes darting as if suddenly aware of being exposed. With a final look at each other, they seemed to reach an unspoken agreement. The man who had taken a step back turned fully, and without another glance toward the house, they both hurried down the steps, quickening their pace as they reached the street. They didn't approach any other houses. They simply walked off, their heads ducked, disappearing down the road until they were swallowed by the darkness. Relief washed over me, though my heart still raced. Luca and Bear stayed alert by the door, their ears perked, listening, waiting, ensuring the men were truly gone. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, my hands shaking slightly as I reached down to comfort them. As soon as the men vanished from sight, I found myself fumbling for my phone, dialing my fiancé's number with trembling fingers. The dogs finally quieted, still tense but seemingly reassured by my presence beside them. The phone rang twice before he picked up, his voice calm and steady on the other end, a stark contrast to the pounding in my chest. I told him everything, my words coming out in a rush, each detail sharpening in my memory as I spoke. He stayed on the line with me, helping me regain my composure. I looked down at Luca and Bear, my fierce protectors, grateful for the way they had reacted. I knew without a doubt that their instincts had sensed something dark, something off, and had acted to keep me safe.